Welcome everyone to DEI Fridays. Today we are so excited to have Dr. Margaret Chin from Hunter College here with us. She will be in conversation with Dr. Angie Beeman, our colleague and my friend here at Baruch at the Marxe School. For those of you who are new here to DEI Friday, welcome. Most of you here are from Baruch, but there are some of you who come in from Hunter and other places at CUNY. We want to welcome you. You are all welcome to the space. We will be here for many Fridays of this semester in this space. I appreciate Ryan bringing that this is a relaxing space. The goal is really for this space to be not just relaxing, but nourishing. There is no pressure here for any of you. Keep your cameras off, put them on, do as you like, eat your lunch, chillax, relax. This is really about us as a community coming together to learn, to grow, and to bring more of an equity lens to our work, but also to our personal lives. So with that said, I want to do multiple things at one time. I want to share screen to read about our community agreements. So we start off with some community agreements every week. And here I'm showing you the Marxe DEI committee website. This has a lot of information. Well, this is our Marxe website. So sorry, this is the DEI committee website. But what I'm going to here is our DEI events website. And here you can see all of the events that are coming up this semester. The next one is next Tuesday. It's going to be actually on a Tuesday, not a Friday, because we're trying to get students in person. But most of them are on Fridays. You can sign up here and read more about them. And this brings us to our community agreements. So what I'd love to do is have a few people raise their hands to read our community agreements. You will each read 2 of the bullets. So can I please have some volunteers? Thank you, Ryan. You know, I'm a professor. I can wait a lot. I'm very comfortable with silence. So I'm waiting for you all. Thank you, Ryan. Go ahead.
Me too. I can wait forever. We are a community in progress. We can struggle together. We can grow together. We will practice active listening, respectful language, and kindness. Did you want to?
Thank you, Christina.
We can ask for literacy moments when there are terms we're not familiar with. We assume positive intent, and we also take responsibility for impact.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to continue?
I'll go. Hi.
Thank you, Teresa.
Okay. We value each other's lived experiences and appreciate the vulnerability necessary to share them.
Thank you. And wait, were those 2? Oh yeah, go ahead. It's good. Teresa, one more.
Apologies, I'm in the one-stop shop, so it's like helping students as well, but want to try to be fully here as well because it's so amazing. We are willing to slow discussions down to facilitate the exploration of complex, nuanced issues.
Thank you. I'm going to read the last 2. We are prepared for discomfort around these topics, even just the title of today's topics, today's book that Margaret will be talking about, Stuck, why Asian Americans can't get to the top of the corporate ladder. So it's definitely, there's discomfort, but we're here for it. If the content seems inappropriate or harmful, we will pause the discussion and may ask folks to discuss privately with the facilitators. If you need support during the presentation, please just direct message me. Okay. So thank you for that. And thank you for adding your voices in here, community. So now, before we begin, we're going to just take 1 minute to become more present in our bodies and in our spaces. I know some of you, like Teresa, are literally working and you have to right now, and we appreciate you being here to the extent that you can, okay? Showing up as part of this, but remember it's recorded, and so you can always watch this later, yeah? But I will invite you right now to join me just for a 1-minute quick grounding. I certainly know I need it by Fridays. I will invite you to close your eyes and take some deep breaths. Keeping your eyes open, you can. If you feel like keeping your camera on and off, you can. Just feel comfortable as you can being here. So for the next about 40 seconds, we're going to sit quietly in silence. And I invite you to do a few key things. I invite you to slow down your breathing and focus on it. It's a way to tell our bodies that we are okay. As we slow down our breathing, helps us become more grounded in where we are, more present to our physical being. I invite you to also think about getting comfortable, physically comfortable in where you're sitting. Maybe stretch a little bit, make some adjustments as necessary. And then finally, I invite you to try your best to bring your full attention to this present moment and the space that we are creating together, what we are going to be learning. I invite you to open your hearts and minds. And I will be quiet now for the next 15 seconds as we continue this process. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. I invite you to slowly, if you had your eyes closed, flutter them open. And we are ready to go. If you liked what we just did and you would like more of that, not necessarily with me, but having a little reset, right? We have the Mindful Monday Reset program that is put together by our Office of Health and Wellness here at Baruch, as well as the DEI Incubator. Thanks for those folks of you who are in the room doing this. And I'm going to put a flyer into the chat right now. And after this whole grounding, we are ready to start our event. The plan will be to have Angie and Margaret in conversation with each other. And then after that, there'll be a chance for Q&A with Margaret. Then we're going to let her go as we do our own work. So we'll be in breakout groups just for about 15 minutes and then come back together to talk about some of the lessons learned. So let me start by introducing Dr. Angie Beeman. Angie is an associate. Okay. Start one more time. I got too relaxed. It's all right. The pressure, because these are being recorded, is always there, but I am trying to power through it. Okay. So Dr. Angie Beeman is an associate professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs here at Baruch College. She is also an affiliate faculty of the Black and Latino Studies Department here at Baruch College. Woohoo, they just got their own major. Fantastic. Okay, so her work examines the evolution of racism, its intersection with economic inequality, and how this process affects institutional practices, identities, and interracial organizing. Dr. Beeman has shared her work with multiple audiences and is frequently invited to organizations to speak on the issues of racism, social justice, allyship, advocacy, and cultivating inclusiveness in the workplace. Her book, Liberal White Supremacy, examines divides among progressives and the role of liberal ideology in silencing racial and class oppression. And it's fantastic. Okay, I'm just saying because I've read that one. Margaret, I'm looking forward to reading yours. So I will stop right here and just say thank you, Angie, so much for helping to put this together, for inviting Margaret, and I leave the floor to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I'm really excited to see all of you here. I'm excited to introduce you to Professor Margaret M. Chin, whose work I found very important to the work I do and to the classes I teach. Professor Chin was born and raised in New York City, a child of Chinese working class immigrant parents. She's a first generation college graduate with her BA from Harvard University and PhD from Columbia University. She's a professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center. And she's best known for her work on immigrant women in the New York City garment industry in the book that she'll be speaking with us about today, Stuck, on Asian Americans in the Corporate World. Professor Chin was also a witness supporting holistic admissions and affirmative action in the Harvard admissions case represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And her work has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, The New York Times, USA Today, and many other news outlets. So Professor Chin, thank you so much for being here with us today. So as Anna mentioned, we have several questions that we developed for breakout sessions after our conversation, and our conversation here at the start is meant to guide and inform. those breakouts for us in terms of how we can think about this practically at Marxe and at Baruch. But I'd like to start with just if you could tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book, why you saw this work as important, and how you came to this research.
Sure. Well, I want to first say it's a pleasure to be invited here into this space. And thank you to Angie and to Anna for having me here at DEI Fridays. I'm glad to see CUNY is doing this. Because I actually think there are many more things that they could actually do to cultivate support for people of color here. Anyway, so I started this research way back in 2013. That's where the seed came from. At that point, I was actually, I was at a reception for Harvard admitted students back in 2013. I did Harvard alumni interviewing, and in that room, there were tons of Asian Americans. And that year, for the freshman class of 2017, they actually accepted 25% Asian Americans. So in that room in New York City at the Harvard Club, there were tons of Asian Americans. And one of the admissions officers, we were just talking about my years doing alumni interviewing and my years doing recruiting when I was a sophomore at Harvard, and that was back in 1981. He said, we've admitted so many Asian Americans since then, we're up to 25%. So how are Asian Americans doing? And he knew at that time I was trying to be promoted to be a full professor. And he knew that, of course, I was a part of the Asian American Alumni Network. So I knew others, but then I started standing there thinking, gee, how many people could I actually name who are in the C-suites? How many people could I actually name I knew who were moving up in these corporations, and even among faculty members, like me. And the truth was I couldn't. You had 25% of the class was Asian American, and that was not the case for people in corporations, and definitely not the case in academia. So for Asian Americans, so that's what kind of spurred me on to this research. So for Asian Americans, we were hitting, an invisible glass ceiling like that for women. We were hitting a bamboo ceiling that's powerful and unbreakable. So here's some numbers. Only 8 S&P 500 companies had Black CEOs in 2022. 42 had Asian Americans, not so bad. 22 had Hispanic Latino CEOs, and 37 were led by women. But that still meant that over 85% of all S&P 500 companies were led by white men. And this is in 2022. Likewise, in Silicon Valley, where you think Asian Americans do really well, 27% of like 5 companies in Silicon Valley, LinkedIn, Yahoo, HP, Google, and Intel had Asian Americans in the workforce in the professional levels, but only 14% of these became executives. And there are similar numbers in law firms too, and almost every industry that you could think of, media, broadcast media, journalism. So like the other groups, we all have differences, but we actually all have a hard time moving up. Some would say it's our family upbringing or culture, but I interviewed over 100 Asian Americans for my study, and many of them said the similar things. So to me, that meant that it wasn't something individual, but it was actually something structural. There was nothing that they did wrong individually, but it was definitely a structural problem. So I'll stop there for that answer. There's more I can say, but I'll leave it there, and I'm sure more of it will come up during Q&A.
Thank you. 2 concepts that inform your work are the model minority myth and the idea of being an honorary white. And I don't want to assume, although these are, I think many people in the audience have heard these terms before, I don't want to assume that we all understand what that means or have the same definition. So could you tell us how you define these ideas or tropes and why they're problematic?
Yeah, sure. But let me add one thing before I get to these tropes, because I think it'll give you an idea why these are tropes. So as I said, there 25% Asian Americans in that incoming class of 2017. And one of the reasons why there is 25% in that particular class is that Harvard has had affirmative action for over 40 years. And I worked in the program that actually recruited students, but we can't say that for any of the industries that I just mentioned. And that is one of the reasons why there are so few Asian Americans or other people of color or women in actually any of these other types of organizations. If you look at the numbers, if you actually notice the numbers, you'll see that. So let me go ahead and define model minority and honorary white. So many of us may know of the term model minority or think of it. It's a term that was coined in 1966 by William Peterson in the New York Times. And at that point, he was talking about Japanese Americans and how successful they were by basically pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. And in 1966, you have to remember that was a time during the civil rights movement when African Americans were actually saying, you know, we've been left out and there needs to be something done systemically because of the color of our skin. We haven't had the education in even K through 12. There was segregation. We haven't been able to get the jobs that we can get. Therefore, there has to be more done systemically. So William Peterson writes this article pointing out how well Asian Americans were doing. And it's just, and that became the trope. So right now, we fast forward to 2023, I'll tell you a little bit about how that's still a trope. So as a race, we're a very diverse group. We have heritage from East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and of course, the Indian subcontinent and the Pacific Islands, right? But if we look closer, we're really a bifurcated population with a huge group at the top of the income ladder, including at the educational levels, and another group at the bottom of the income ladder as well. And so when you take the median of the very high and the very low, we end up hitting a median that's above the national average. But in New York City, we actually have many Asian Americans. And in fact, in New York City, we have Asian Americans have the highest poverty level out of any racial group in New York City. When we look at the very top, we actually have Chinese immigrants at the very top and Indian immigrants at the very top. And many of them come to the US already with a college degree. And the numbers that come here into the US are actually, if you look back in their homeland, they are a very selected group. I forget the number, but I think over 60% of these two particular groups have BAs in the US. That's higher than the people in the US, and actually higher than that of in their individual homelands. Only like less than 20% or like 15% have college degrees in China, and only about that same amount have college degrees in India. So they are a very, very select group that come into the US. And of course, it makes our income and college education level look very different. And if you look at the bifurcation of the Asian American group, this also hides the story of the professionals too. It hides the story of professionals trying to climb to the top because people just assume we're all the model minority, the group that happens to show up in the census number or the group that shows up in the education numbers. But if you break it down, disaggregate all of the different ethnic groups, you'll actually see that Asian Americans are very diverse in of themselves. Now, the other point to look at is that the honorary white terminology that Andy just mentioned, I don't actually use honorary white really in my work or actually when I speak, although other people do use that term. I try to get away from that terminology because what it does is it leaves out Asian Americans. It now only talks about our racial situation in the US as either Black or white. And what it does is that it makes us even more invisible. As I was mentioning already, you know, the model minority hides the true stories of Asian Americans. The in the country. It hides the stories of all the different Asian American ethnic groups. So honorary white actually reinforces that. So what I try to do is that explain, and I actually have examples of this in my book too, that Asian Americans actually face discrimination and racism very differently than Black or Latino Americans. And that's something that we should actually recognize. So when I interviewed the 100 people in my book, a lot of them said that their parents face discrimination and not themselves. But in talking, they all mentioned very common examples, such as, people asking them where they're from, even though the people I actually interviewed were all born in the US or they were raised in the US. I chose that population for a specific reason, so that they would all know American cultural symbols. They all went to middle school in the US, they all went to high school in the US. They had no accents. And they were all accustomed to not just doing well in schools in terms of getting good test grades or getting high grades in school, but they all knew to get leadership positions in being who they are. But they were still stereotyped in a certain way. So Asian Americans thought that they didn't face racism because they weren't followed by cops like African Americans or Latinos were. They weren't harassed by cops, rather. They weren't followed in stores. But they did face anti-Asian American hate, as we see recently. They've all been asked, where do you come from? Why is your English so good? And we should all assume or recognize that these are actually racist statements. Now, we have to begin to understand that, and that the story of Asian Americans have to be included in the story of Asian American history in the US. As one of the worker I interviewed who moved up, he became a chief officer in his organization. He basically said that you have to recognize Asian Americans for who they are, whether you yourself see yourself as, no matter how Asian American you are, because if you don't name yourself as an Asian American, you you don't bring your whole self to the C-suite room, you don't bring all that you can offer to the table. And that's what other people may need to recognize too, that why promote an Asian American if you can't show that you're an Asian American? How different are you from the other people? Does that answer that question?
Yes, that was wonderful, really insightful, and I think will be really helpful as we think through these ideas. And in fact, what you just said, that part of your book really did strike me, because, and it's connected to my next question, which I'll ask in a second, but if you can't, it has to do with this issue of trust and not being able to feel like your genuine self at work, which coincidentally is something that I was just speaking with a former student about, and not feeling like you can be your genuine self in the workplace. And so that also then connects with how well people trust you, how well you can be social, and those kinds of skills are important for promotion. And I also want to say that your comments on the problematics of honorary white and model minority myth, I think that was a really important analysis and historical analysis, and it's where I also see a connection between our work, because partly what we're both doing is kind of exposing and breaking silences. And with model minority myth and the honorary white tropes, that those ideas silence both the racism against Asian Americans and African Americans simultaneously. And so I'm constantly looking for solidarity across those lines. But I wanted to ask, in your book, you share the experience of Alice, who's a Korean American woman, and she stated, a senior vice president, so I'm bringing in some data from your book, so for those who have a chance to read it all, maybe you can get a piece of it here. A senior vice president at the investment banking firm where I worked sat me down in her office and asked me, how do you like the job? Then she added, we know that you're doing a great job, but you should make an effort to speak up more and make an effort to make people get to know you. I discovered too late that techniques for school and college success, working hard, being smart, being the best at what you do, and not rocking the boat, were useless past junior level positions. Can you talk more about experiences like Alice's and the barriers your respondents faced? For example, how their work was evaluated, how they experienced notions of merit and trust, and how they were regarded regarded in terms of leadership skills.
Yeah, sure. So Alice, I'd say is pretty typical. Her story resonated with many of my interviewees, and in fact, many of them repeated a similar story, although they all had different ways of trying to overcome it. And in talking about her story, I came up with a name for something I found, the Asian American Playbook. And a lot, or I say all of them, no matter which ethnicity, whether you're from the Indian subcontinent or you're from, your heritage is from Korea, or even from your heritage is, from Southeast Asia, they all mention something that's very similar. So this Asian American Playbook, it's a technique for getting, for succeeding through school and college. You work hard, you're smart, you be the best at what you can do, you try not rocking the boat, right? But basically, what parents and what students share with each other is this informal and practical how-to guide for Asian Americans designed to show them how to make it and to be successful at both school and work. That was the idea. And note that the playbook mentions more than just tests to get into colleges and doing well in school. So this is not an Asian playbook, because in Asia, most of the countries, they just look at test scores to get into colleges, to get into grad school, and to do well. So this is a very Asian American playbook, and it's geared to getting rewards in the US. But what all of them actually found out was that it's not enough to get past the mid-level in careers. So the general playbook says that, you Asian Americans work hard, have access to opportunity, are in control of the situation, choose what they want to do with their lives, and find rewards for themselves and their families. And of course, this dovetails with the Asian American image, the mainstream model minority image that the American public accepts as a generic story. This also, it's also a story that's really good for working class Asian American parents to pass on too, especially if they don't speak English, right? And they don't have access to networks that can help their children. So overall though, if you think about it, if you take out the Asian American part of it, it also reflects all of the aspirations that all immigrants, I'd say, have. Immigrants want for their children, right, in the US. So it's important for everybody, but I call it the Asian American Playbook because all of them said this to me. So yes, it's something that's passed along. Maybe it's part of the Asian American culture. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, the numbers of Asian Americans in corporations, especially moving on up, it's actually very similar to other groups. They're actually halted at the mid-level for Asian Americans. Some other groups actually have a hard time even getting their foot in the door, right? So while the experiences for all of these groups may be different on the work floor, Asian Americans, according to this playbook, and as what Alice said, they're seen as very competent, capable people, but lacking leadership skills and sometimes even social skills. So my interviewees, in describing this, they felt invisible on the floor, which also plays into that stereotype that I just talked about. So, but they also wanted to be authentic. They also wanted to be Asian American in as many ways as they want. So for Jack, the person who talks about this, he actually feels that, people can tell when people aren't talking about their whole selves. They can actually tell that somebody may be hiding something. So that may make it so that people may not trust you. So he actually encourages Asian Americans when he mentors them that you just have to be yourself. There are other examples that people gave individually, how they learn to be trustful, like So Yun talked about how it's great to talk about your kids, talk about the weather, to learn to get to know someone. And somebody else mentioned that if you have a hard time feeling comfortable, ask them about where they go on vacations and talk to them about how you may want to go there or how you went on vacations, at least find something to start with. So that's on the personal level that people can try to do that. But because so many people mention trust, I actually looked at the research on trust. So I looked at the research and I found that it's actually difficult for Asian Americans to be trusted. Amy Cuddy and Susan Fisk, who did research on the stereotype content model, said that this stereotype for Asian Americans is very, very dangerous, and the stereotype of the quiet intellect. So the quiet intellect in the workforce, if these folks can be your friend, they can be really, really helpful. But if they're a foe and you're not seen as a friend, they can be seen as very, very dangerous. And this is a stereotype that many Asian Americans feel. So in the corporations, according to my interviewees, they can feel this on the job force. It's not so much that they can't do the work, because when I met all of these people, all 100 of them, 103 actually, they all seemed so competent, but they also had all the warmth, all the personality, all the leadership skills that you could possibly imagine. And I had a hard time grasping the difficulties that they have, but when they shared the same stories, I realized that trust is a really huge component. And this trust is connected to the larger stereotype that I'm going to say it's forever foreigner or the perpetual foreigner. That's linked to those questions when people ask us about why we don't speak English or they can't comprehend why we speak English well. And they can't comprehend that there are many generations of us in the US. And I think that it became a lot clearer after my book came out during COVID, when we saw the former President Trump talk about the Kung flu, talk about, and we see the rise of anti-Asian hate all across the US. So in many ways, we all kind of have to learn these ideas, but in many ways too, Jack also mentioned that, we are similar to many other groups. We are similar to many other groups, especially the LGBTQ audience or the workers, because we don't want to hide who we are, because we know what happened to them when they hid who they were. So we have to be able to express who we are, and we have to support other groups in doing the same. And I know for African Americans in the workforce, it's really difficult as well, and for Latinos. So he expressed the need to share our stories and to be allies with these other groups. So I'm going to end here on that question, and I hope that shed some light on that particular question for you.
Thank you. And so I see a question in the chat from Catherine Law. She states, I would love to hear more about the structural problem that you mentioned earlier.
Sure. So, I mean, it's the structural problem has to do with right now, I think for Asian Americans, is that people know very little about us overall. I mean, I'm talking to a group that probably knows more than the general public, even though you may feel like you know very little about Asian Americans. I'd say you know more than the general public does. Most people would not even realize that we actually have a long history in the US. And so that's part of the structural problem, knowing that we are actually Americans for many generations. And that's the beginning of it, to actually probably put more about our histories into the textbooks in K through 12 education, more than the Chinese Exclusion Act and more than the Japanese internment. There's a long history here that we share in the US where we were actually going to schools that were segregated, just like African Americans and Latinos. There's a long history of us not being allowed to work in certain jobs as well. That's very similar. We've overcome a lot. So I have to say, we have made progress, just like all groups in the US, but there's still a lot more to do.
And also what you say in your book about the returns on education not being the same for Asian Americans as they are for whites, and that there's this idea that Asian Americans are doing so well, but then like you say, that when you look at promotions, it's having to do so much more additional labor than others just to get that promotion, and then not being promoted because of long-term historical ideas about who's trusty, who's trustworthy, who's suspicious.
Yeah,
and you document that
absolutely.
in your interview.
Absolutely. And I think what some people are fearful of is this, there's only limited positions, but, you know, in the US, our GNP has been growing, you know, every single year. I don't think there's been a single year where our GNP hasn't grown. So that means that there's actually plenty of room for everybody. But corporations will always look to pay the least. Sorry, I'm a sociologist, and you know, to certain groups of people. So they're always going to look to find certain groups of people that fits in certain areas where they don't have to promote and where they don't have to pay as much. So I think that you know, it's a false idea to think that there isn't room for all of us, you know, including white men, you know. So in reality, there's plenty of room for all of us, including in the schools and K through 12, in higher education, and in the workforce.
Are there other questions that people had for Professor Chin? Catherine Law again is asking, does Dr. Chin think that the NACEA competencies that include equity and inclusion in assisting in educating people about Asian cultures? I guess asking what you think about that.
You have to tell me a little bit more. I know that they're starting to, they're beginning to look at Asian American history for K to 12 in the New York area, New York City public schools. I don't know when they're finally going to implement that. I know California and some other locations, I forget where, actually have that. And I actually think that part of DEI should be sharing our histories in the US so that people understand that all the different groups have a shared history, and that shared history is really American history.
Yeah, I've seen some change in my daughter's school here in New Jersey. My children always complain about that Asian Americans are the one group that they don't really go over in May. And when they do, it's very quickly. But I have seen a shift within the last couple of years where they've started including that a bit more. And it's a shame to think that is probably because of what has happened with COVID-19 and the targeting and the racial violence against Asian Americans. But I just like to remind people that violence didn't happen just now. It's not just a recent thing, but there's a long history of that should also be examined in curriculum. Christina, so I guess we take one last question, if that's okay, Anna, or do you think? Okay, because we do have a question from Christina Balboa, who is on our DEI committee at Marxe, and she asks, for Asian Americans who do make it to the C-suite, do you see a transformation from the Asian American playbook to a different approach to engagement and success? Or do these people assimilate to white US norms of leadership and engagement? Or do they become more openly authentic about being Asian American?
I have to say they do both, you know, because right now we exist in a place where there's transformation, right? So I think when I was interviewing people, I stopped interviewing people 2018. So it was before COVID, before the rise in anti-Asian American hate crimes. So people saw it both ways. Some people saw themselves as a mentor to other Asian Americans, and some actually felt fearful that they would be, it would hurt their careers if they only mentored Asian Americans. But all the people in the lower levels all felt that they couldn't actually find an Asian American, or maybe even a person of another group that can actually be their close mentor. So for a lot of Asian Americans, it was just difficult. all around. The people who did have close mentors, majority of them were not Asian American. And that, of course, fits the numbers, right? Because Asian Americans are not up at these high levels and are not at these high levels where they can actually have the time to actually mentor people. They might be striving, to try to move ahead. So it's difficult, but yes, I did see people doing both. And I think more people in the DEI space can try to convince people that it's actually very important to mentor. If you made it through, you should be able to pull somebody else with you through. And I really believe in that. At least one other person through. Because you have to at least be replaced. You can't be the last one, so at least one and hopefully more.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your work with us. I know you also have another book coming up in the next year or so. Is that what we're looking at? Or you're finishing it up now, so we can look for future work from you as well?
Yeah, so this book is called The Peer Effect: How Your Peers Shape Who You Are and Who You Become. I'm writing it with Syed Ali, who's a professor of sociology at Long Island University, and he's the first author on this book. And we are on a mad dash to finish the book because they just told us all of a sudden that they're moving it to instead of being it in the first quarter 2024, they want to publish it the third quarter. So that's what I'm heading off to do. I'm right now I'm on sabbatical, so I want to finish that before I go back to my departmental duties.
Thank you so much, and yes, that you took time from your sabbatical to do this with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Margaret.
Thank you again for having me.
Yeah, I was just gonna pop in to say thank you again so much. We really appreciate your time. It's wonderful to hear about people across CUNY who are doing this really important work, and the fact that you came to share with us, we just appreciate it. And we'll let you go now, because now it's time for us to have our conversations about how to take in what you've shared with us today and the learning, and how to start, implementing some of the suggestions that you've given us here at Baruch. So thank you again so much. And we will say a virtual thank you, claps, and goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your sabbatical. We look forward to hearing about your new book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna and Angie. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Angie, thank you so much for being in conversation with Margaret. I really appreciate it. And now we are off to our breakout groups. So we will have a short and sweet time for breakout groups. If you have to leave before, we understand, but this is a really important part of this program, right? It's for you to get to know each other and build community with people who really care deeply about these issues and want to learn and grow together. So we have, I'm not sure how many breakout, I've got to redo them in a second because some people left, that's fine. But I am going to, start the breakout rooms in a moment, and please join. And I'm putting all the questions in the chat. Feel free to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, but this is our suggestion in terms of thinking about some of the themes that came out in our discussion. We will see you in a couple of minutes, let's say about 10 minutes. And I just need to, few people. Okay, there we go. All right, please go ahead into your breakout rooms. We'll see you in about 10 minutes. Hi, Victoria and Catherine. Nice to meet you. Sorry, I popped in just to give you all the questions before. Nice to meet you. Catherine, I've seen you've come before to these. I appreciate it. And nice to have you here. Yeah, it's great. Hello, folks. Thank you all for coming on back. I know that I just want to mention that it is totally fine for people who have to leave early. That typically happens, and that's okay. That's why we record these things. But for those of you who are able to stay with us for the whole hour, we appreciate it. So at this point, I would like to just invite one or two of you, or maybe three. We've just got about 3 or 4 minutes left, just to share any insights that came out of your group, something that struck you, something maybe that you'll take away from today's session.
You emphasized her phrase, forever foreigner, which I also hadn't heard before. And I do think that is that captures a lot of people's experiences.
Hey, Anna, Victoria and I, we were talking about, the wording model minority. So of course, everyone, well, we have heard of it a lot. And the honorary white was something that I, and also Victoria, we said we have not heard of, and that is really kind of derogatory. And it's something that, as I think groups like this, where we have these meetings, we can talk about things and educating people about the cultural fluencies. And I brought up the NACE 8 core competencies, and it was the education of both sides. And, Victoria and I are going to catch up and, kind of work together in regards to, again, it's all about students and helping them with the soft skills. So it was really important to have these. And again, I always enjoy having your speaker series and being able to break out and talk about certain things.
I think actually that's a good point to kind of wrap up on, because I just again want to say thank you, Catherine, you and others who show up here. You're what makes this, right? We are a community together. We are a community in progress, and we are all on our journeys to learn and grow in these areas. And I think what is amazing about having these speakers come in and having people like Angie, Christina, and the other colleagues on the DEI committee support these efforts and bring people in to learn more, is to keep this on the forefront of our minds, and to recognize that we're all in progress, right? Every day we're learning something new. And what I shouldn't have mentioned in the beginning, but I forgot to, is you all know we have a lot of Asian and Asian American students right here at Baruch, right? And that was, what I hadn't gotten to mention in the beginning as to like why we're doing this, right? So this particular session, because each session has its own particularities, right? We're not just grabbing anything that's DEI related, right? We're really thinking about our community here. We're thinking about what are the most pressing issues for us, for people here at Baruch, at CUNY, and also in New York City. And so just to say that I think this is very important, Catherine, as you pointed out, to know kind of what we can do, each of us, regardless of what we look like, our identities and whatnot, but how we can show up for our Asian and Asian American students, as well as our colleagues, right? So Catherine, just like you, we're always like, focus on the students, and that's why we're all here. But we also, I think, in this DEI space, want to focus on our community, which includes our, fellow colleagues, and also on ourselves, yeah? So it is 1 o'clock on the dot. So I will say thank you to everyone. Again, I will put all this stuff in the chat. So please feel free to listen to our DEI Fridays playlist on Spotify, put some stuff in there. As Angie said, we may want to stay away from the death metal and the heavy metal, but chatting before, anything chill, relaxed, please feel free to add there. And we thank you again for being here. Angie, thank you so much for doing the session with me, and see you all in 2 Fridays. Bye.